We must function based on what is true in order to liberate ourselves. The absolute fact is that Willie Lynch never existed. They've got our people believing so much mental enslaving lies that telling the truth now literally offends millions of black people. Nonetheless, those who know the truth must teach. Because if our understandings remains flawed, then all of our liberating remedies and strategies that stem from those false beliefs will also be flawed. Therefore, we must teach the truth, whether it fills the room or clears it out. Because we are called to awaken the sleeping sheep, not to appease the mentally enslaved goats. Black people are not suffering from the Willie Lynch slave syndrome because Willie Lynch never existed. Our collective mental condition as black people has nothing to do with a Willie Lynch slave syndrome. The Willie Lynch letter was actually written in 1970 by Dr. Akina Ashanti. He described our condition based on what he witnessed during modern times. This is why it appears so accurate. This is also why when experts examined the letter, they found that it contained modern words not consistent with its presented 1700 date. The Willie Lynch slave syndrome is not the cause of the black self-loathing, division, and undeserving adoration towards whites that exists among far too many black people. We also know that those symptoms have nothing to do with slavery because they also exist amongst black people whose ancestors were not enslaved. Not because many people believe something to be true doesn't make it true. It most often means that they all received the same disinformation and started repeating it without researching the facts for themselves. This is the case regarding the Willie Lynch slave syndrome myth. It's believed by those who are clueless of how true brainwashing is actually achieved. Because that silly myth presents what would in fact be the least effective method used for controlling generations of people, millions of people, down generational lines. It's not how true brainwashing is achieved. That premise is in fact cartoonishly unrealistic. It's absolutely not how true brainwashing is actually achieved. True brainwashing requires a system that's being constantly reapplied and reinforced upon the minds of targeted populations. If not, the brainwashing effects would lessen with each new generation, not becoming worse as we witness with our own people. Case in point, during the 1960s, we probably wore afros, braids, and we called ourselves brothers and sisters. Today, many of our women are now ashamed to wear their natural hair and insist on concealing it under European weaves. And we call ourselves by the N-word. If our collective condition was caused by anything done to us during slavery, it would have lessened with each new generation as we move further away from the era of slavery. But this isn't the case. We've in fact worsened. We've worsened because our collective condition has absolutely nothing to do with the Willie Lynch slave syndrome myth. I'm going to tell you the truth of our collective condition, but before doing so, I must make you aware of the fact that believing in the Willie Lynch myth negatively impact our culture, our communities, and our collective psyches. Because, upon learning of the Willie Lynch myth, most black people perceive it as being our duties to share the information with our friends and family. But doing so actually negatively impacts our communities. Case, point, and proof. Within the U.S. military doctrine on psychological warfare, it states that an effective way to psychologically harm and subdue a large targeted population without having to physically fight them is by manipulating them to believe that there's something internally wrong with themselves. When people have been made to believe that their core problem is an internalized one, this psychologically deflates their collective self-esteem, makes them self-doubting, It demoralizes them. It turns their collective aggressions and frustrations away from their true enemies, and it redirects it towards themselves. It also makes them more compliant with the dominance of other groups over their lives. Many will even prefer it. This is what believing in the Willie Lynch slave syndrome actually does to black people. When black people accept that the Willie Lynch myth is true, we're also accepting the premise that there's something internally wrong with us. This is very harmful to our collective psyches. Now, here's the true reason why many black people are now self-loathing, divided, perceive ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres Caucasians in spite of a brutally horrific history of the contrary. It's nothing to do with a slave syndrome. This noted mindset amongst many black people that clearly benefits the white society is by deliberate design. It's always by deliberate design whenever the oppressed starts thinking exactly as the oppressors wants them to think. This mindset was deliberately subliminally embedded into the minds of many black people without most even realizing it. There are 4 ways to effectively manipulate the human brain: by what we're taught, by what we see, by what we hear, and through repetition. Because the white society controls the education we're taught, the media images we see, and the societal narratives that we repetitively hear, these combined factors allows them to manipulate our collective minds in ways that serve their white society. Regardless of how intelligent people are, if it's possible to control the input of what's fed into the human mind, it's entirely possible to control what people will think and what they'll believe. The white educational system's failure to adequately provide black students with a racially affirming curriculum, as it does so for white students, is actually a psychological warfare tactic that is essential for maintaining white social dominance over the black population. Because for a ruling class to maintain its position of social dominance over the oppressed population, they must condition the oppressed from a very early age to accept their own subordinate status and to adhere to the authority of the dominant culture. To do so, the education given to the oppressed population from the time that their minds are young must be the type that denies them of a racially affirming education. When the oppressed population is denied a racially affirming education, this psychologically conditions them to perceive themselves through a false inherent inferior identity that makes them more accepting of their subordinate status within the society dominated by their oppressors. This is precisely what's being done to black people during our education development. It's the true reason why we're learning more racially affirming facts from each other than we do so from within our white governed schools. This is the case. Black students are taught instead from a curriculum that primarily exalts the history and contributions and achievements of whites only, while marginalizes their own. In fact, for many black people, our schools are in fact the places where we first experience the implication that there's something inherently lesser and wrong about being black. This black racially devaluing educational curriculum is being pumped into the impressionable young minds of a generation of black students without being counterbalanced by an equal amount of positive racially affirming information. Consequently, black students must constantly resist the negative perceptions of being black implicit in the educational curriculum, almost exclusively dedicated to the white society, the white's achievements, white contributions, and white ideologies. Furthermore, black students are subjected to this demoralizing miseducation for 7 hours a day from the ages of 5 through 18. Clearly, considerable damage can be done to the self-esteem and the psyches of black students within such a large time frame. Schools are tools of the government designed to mold the student's character accordingly to the will of the government. During our education development, We are being psychologically conditioned to believe lesser of ourselves and to believe more of Caucasians. White social scientists describe this nefarious practice as merely instilling a value system into the collective minds of Black people that makes us adhere to the authority and existing infrastructure of the white dominant culture. We're also being perpetually manipulated, even after we graduate, through unrelenting media propaganda campaigns that subliminally programs our minds. The white media's unrelenting negative depiction of Black people that constantly subjects Black people to receiving only the fraudulent worst narratives and imageries about ourselves is a Black racially demoralizing divide and rule psychological warfare campaign. Demoralized divide and rule is the method of maintaining control over a targeted population through unrelenting demoralization in order to create self-loathing and division amongst them. This condition makes the targeted population much easier to subjugate and control. This is what's being deployed against Black people. The white society exclusively controls Black people's media images and writes all of our societal narratives. Therefore, Black people interpret our communities according to information and images presented by the white society. This literally means that white people controls Black people's interpretation of our collective state. They've weaponized this scenario against us. But our white social scientists determined a long time ago that by perpetually negatively distorting what we believe about ourselves, they could divide us, demoralize us, and shift Black collective aggressions away from the white society and redirect it against ourselves. And we can then be ruled over forever, because it hinders our ability to unify ourselves against the white oppressive society. This system is deployed like a massive media marketing campaign that constantly subjects Black people to receiving only the fraudulent worst narratives and media images about ourselves. Within this system, fraudulent Black racially demoralizing propaganda is being pumped unrelentingly into the unsuspecting minds of the Black population. Again, without being challenged or counterbalanced with an equal amount of Black positive racially affirming information. Its weapon is the message that it carries and the way that it adversely affects the Black population in terms of our behaviors. It conveys the subliminal message that Black people are now our own worst enemies and that we therefore need white people to govern over our lives. Moreover, that Black people should admire, respect, and trust only whites. This system is extremely effective because when Black people are repetitively presented these noted narratives from trusted white media sources, it can be very difficult to resist its implied subliminal propaganda programming, especially when the propaganda is being told daily and so unrelentingly. With time, being unable to refute the constant negative information about ourselves, many Black people eventually comes to accept them. They unconsciously influence how many within the Black communities perceive ourselves, creating division and self-hatred among us. It also turns the collective aggressions of the Black masses away from the white society and redirected against ourselves. It's why we're always speaking negatively about ourselves. You see it all the time. We're always speaking negatively about ourselves. This is achieved by constantly inundating the Black population with fraudulent, negative, demoralizing information about ourselves that misleads us to believe that it's ourselves that are now our own worst enemies. This brainwashing system is so effective that many Black people now insist that their negative assessment about our racial group is accurate. They believe they confirmed it themselves. However, in reality, those Black people that presently makes those negative generalizations about our racial group cannot actually validate these statements based upon their own personal experiences. Those that insist that they have are not critically thinking and they are delusional, because it's not humanly possible to assess the collective state of millions of people based upon anyone's individual experiences. It's not humanly possible. Those negative perceptions about our entire racial group were actually indoctrinated into our collective minds by white media social engineering scientists and white propagandists. When people are constantly inundated with negative lies about themselves, Those lies become their reality. They begin to see only those things that appears to confirm those lies, and they become psychologically blind from seeing everything that refutes it. It's called the illusionary truth effect. White oppressive forces have thoroughly studied this mental phenomenon and has weaponized it against Black people. This psychological warfare works so well, in fact, that it not only makes Black people more compliant with white dominance over our lives, it in fact makes many Black people even prefer white dominance over our lives. It is at the root of the division and self-hatred now affecting many Black people, and it's why many Black people revere as Caucasians in spite of a horrific history to the contrary. This is the truth of our reality, nothing to do with a silly slave syndrome. As Franz Fanon said, the oppressed will always believe the fraudulent worst about themselves. It is time to wake up to our reality. It is time to wake up to our reality. The time of believing in dumb shit is over. One love and peace.